Hey there. Welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here again. For you, it probably feels like, well, I just heard this guy do this last week, but for me, it's been a couple weeks because I recorded First Look early and then sent it to you when I would normally. And so this feels like kind of getting back to something that now I haven't done in a couple weeks. And so it's good to be back. We had a lovely time in Maine. And now I'm coming back right into a pretty exciting time in the church. And we're starting almost as exciting as it gets because we have World Communion Sunday here this Sunday, which kind of starts. I think I've sort of offhandedly talked about this portion of the year as like identity season, discovering who we are, thinking about who we are, where we're going. And it starts with the banners, the confessional banners will be up, and we're beginning this time between now and Advent, where we have World Communion that kind of begins that discussion when it comes to who we are, and then we move right into soon thereafter stewardship season, where we do a lot of discussion of that, and then All Saints, where we kind of reconsider that, and then we end that time in November with the Reign of Christ, or Christ the King Sunday. There's the PW Sunday in the middle there in November. And so it's a lot of that kind of idea, which is great and interesting. And to start this off, it's very, very special because our international partnership is being celebrated, and we have a special guest preacher to begin all of this. And so the Reverend Dr. Humphreys Fraxon Zigambo, who is from Malawi, will be bringing the word and presiding over the communion table with me on Sunday. And it's just kind of an amazing opportunity to do all that. And so, when we invited him to preach, of course, he graciously not only accepted, but then asked, what would you like me to preach on? And I guess there's something you're doing, very thoughtful. And I said, well, it's World Communion Sunday, and so we'll be looking at this. You can choose whatever scriptures you think go along with that idea. And this is the one he chose, which is couldn't be any more appropriate. And so we'll be looking at that in a moment. But just the chance to do World Communion Sunday with someone from, another part of the world, to bring another perspective on what that means, on what communion means, about what faith means, about what community and peace and reconciliation look like, because that's what he'll be preaching on. To get that from another perspective is just such a breath of fresh air for me, and it's such a wonderful beginning to this season. And I've only had email correspondence back and forth so far with Humphreys, but he just is clearly just a very experienced, very wise. Has a lot of not only local congregational experience, but broader synod experience. Just to have all of that kind of at once is a pretty special thing. So I'm really looking forward to doing that with him. But what you're going to find here is that he's going to be preaching on a fairly familiar passage, and he has a couple of epistles that are a passage from Ephesians, a passage from 2 Corinthians that will complement this text from the Beatitudes, which is so Matthew 5, 1 through 8, is where he's going to be looking. And I think anytime you can look at a text like this, especially one that's really familiar, you always tend to look at it, understand it, of course, from your own vantage point. And I think for all of us, at least the vast majority of our lives have been spent here in the United States. And even if you have an upbringing, or even if you have a time that you've spent in other places or around the world, the vast majority of our time has been spent here. And so when we look at what does it mean to be peacemakers, what does it mean to have reconciliation, what does it mean to be blessed, that takes on a very local perspective, obviously. When the Beatitudes, of course, go through blessed are thee, blessed are thee. And so you and I look at that from our own perspective. The vast majority of us are Caucasian, spent the vast majority of our time middle class, however you describe that for yourselves. We've all had our hardships, we've all had difficult beginnings, we've all had times when we felt very outsider. But we all, I think, in this congregation, by and large, the vast majority of us grew up relatively similarly, or at least have a lot of overlapping experiences. And, I don't know Reverend Dr. Zagombo. He may have had very, very similar experiences also. But he's, if nothing else, he is preaching and teaching in a very different context. And so that part for me, I think, is going to be fascinating. How does he look at what it means to be blessed? How does he look at what it means, for God to be reconciling? Just because I think of things in my own American context, there might be a lot of crossovers. It might be very different. I think that's the beauty of it, is the comparisons and contrasts, I think, will be fascinating, and how he decides to look at that. But then also, of course, we're looking at it through the lens of communion. And anytime we look at something through the lens of communion, we think about the images, the invitational nature of the table, the sacrifice, the promise that we see represented in the elements, that kind of embodiment of Christ in the world. And so what that means, like what that table means, especially when we're thinking about it from a world perspective, that Christianity, that faith, that the church, its history isn't owned by anybody, we don't have some unique claim on it. We see the world through our eyes, but, the way we understand who God is, how God acts in the world, isn't owned by, by who we are. We have our own version, as other people have their own version. And again, we look for the commonalities and differences, the things that make it unique. So those are the things I'm looking forward to this coming week. Not knowing exactly what all that's going to look like, but excited about that. In addition, before I read the passage itself, there are going to be a number of events surrounding that international partnership. It's not just on Sunday, although there is, Humphreys will be there, I believe. He's scheduled at least to be there for the adult Bible study in the morning, the service, and then, of course, the fellowship time afterwards. But in addition to those things, there are events throughout next week at different locations, and that we're all invited to be a part of. One of which Reverend Bill Paul, who helped to begin this partnership almost 35 years ago. He'll be honored at one of those events, and there's a sprinkling of other things kind of along the way that we're invited to be a part of. And so just an encouragement to all of you to say, to be able to kind of invest some time and learn about that partnership. We'll be sending out things electronically, as I said on Sunday. We were just preparing that today, so look for that here soon. And if you have any questions about that, or how those events work, or how you can be a part of them, you can certainly talk to Ted Mills, who's a big part of helping to organize all of this. Robin McMillan will be one of the hosts, or you can talk to myself or the office, and we can help direct you to how all that will work. But those are things we're all looking forward to between now and I think the 13th of October, I think, is when that's kind of ending, 13 or 14. So you have a couple weeks to kind of be a part of that. So that's very exciting. All right, so the passage, Matthew 5, 1 through 8. Besides recognizing that Humphreys will be talking about this from a reconciliation and togetherness kind of place, I don't know exactly where he'll take it, but these are my humble thoughts as we move forward. So, Matthew 5, 1 through 8. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And of course, it continues on, but that was the concentration that he had for this week. So for as many sermons as you've heard about this passage, there's just as many thoughtful kind of ways of understanding it. And I think there's a few things that sort of jump out at me as we start to kind of talk about what that could mean for us. First, I think it's important that you see this passage in more than one gospel, because that means that it was a significant enough thing for us to keep paying attention to. Not that the things that only show up in one gospel aren't important, but anytime you see something in the Gospels or in Scripture several times or more than once, it lends itself to us thinking about that as, if I'm going to look at the major themes or the things that really speak out to who this person is, this is something I should pay attention to. If someone says something once, if you're a politician or something and you say it once offhandedly, maybe that's not a big part of your message, but if you say it over and over and over again, then that's something for us to kind of identify you with. And I think this is one of those things that the Gospels are trying to tell us is a staple of who Jesus is, like the feeding of the 5,000 or his death and resurrection. So as we look at the Beatitudes and we think about this sermon and who he taught it to, this one happens to be, first, it's out in Galilee. Okay, so I happen to have been to the place that they believe could have been where this this sermon occurred. And it's this kind of beautiful green, the lake is in the background. It's kind of this beautiful place. And assuming that he, preached it on a nice day, uh, but so it's in this kind of beautiful, picturesque kind of place. And he's talking to a group of people who, where he starts off, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's his opening line. And at least, and so you start to kind of imagine where the people were, emotionally as they're hearing this. So the juxtaposition of this beautiful place, serene and peaceful, against where people must have been and why Jesus is preaching to them in the first place. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's where they're at. And and there's a couple of things for us to kind of understand about that. One, Jesus is speaking to where people are emotionally. This isn't hypothetical. This isn't some concept, some theological concept that is abstract. I mean, this is, really speaking to their hearts. And I think that's a huge element of how we should approach Scripture and how we approach our faith. Is that these aren't just abstract ideas, but they're things that hit us in the heart, hit us, where we are today. But I think also, too, the recognition that faith is inherently emotional, that all of the things that we go through, the fact that this says, blessed are the poor in spirit, speaks to that kind of emotional connection that then has a tie to what we're experiencing, around us. Famously, if you look at Luke, and you're looking at the Beatitudes in Luke, it says, blessed are the poor, not blessed are the poor in spirit. And what that has always said to me was that there's Jesus is making this very tangible connection between the stresses of the world, what makes us poor, what makes a person literally poor, and what that does to us, the kind of the trauma of that, which I think is this, having both, I think speaks to so much of the way our society struggles with talking about poverty and talking about how we respond to it, why people continue, what makes the struggle of poverty so cyclical, what makes it so drowning, how it changes your worldview, how it changes the way you understand the world around you, what your opportunities are in the world, what you can accomplish, what you can achieve, what you're worth. All of that gets kind of entrenched in poverty. And so the fact that we have blessed are the poor and blessed are the poor in spirit, recognizing that those two can and are most often the same, I think is a huge element of this. And then you look at those who mourn, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That all of that, it kind of is talking about the emotional toil of wherever they're at. I think that's a powerful way of understanding how Jesus sees us, how Jesus is trying to reach us. because the two aren't separated in that way. So when we talk about kind of moving this towards how that passage speaks to our physical and emotional state, into what it means for Jesus to be one who reconciles, and what the table means in that sense. One, it flattens hierarchies. And by that I mean Jesus talking to people in that way, I think, speak to however you get to a place where you are poor in spirit or hunger and thirst for righteousness. However you get there, you have a place here. Because if you're hungering and thirsting, using that kind of phraseology would speak to people who are literally hungering and thirsting. I mean, who literally don't have enough resources. But those who are also seeking justice and righteousness around those issues, either because they don't have enough, or because they could be providing enough, or because they're simply they're in an emotional state of unbalance. All of that is present in this sermon, and which means you can find yourself in this sermon regardless of who you are or where you're coming from or where you're going, which is, of course, one of the pieces that makes it brilliant. But then there's also kind of a call to action in it as well, because it doesn't just stay there. Like, God cares about you and loves you and wants what's best for you. If you find yourself being someone who is poor in spirit, if you find yourself that you are mourning, if you find yourself meek, if you find yourself in those states, but there's also there's a call to you in terms of how we claim that wholeness for ourselves. Be merciful, be pure of heart. If you read on, be a peacemaker. Be willing to act for righteousness. Those are the things that we can do to respond, regardless of where we're coming from. And that leaves us not just in a state of ineptitude, or like just, well, this is just my state and there's nothing I can do about it. It means that we have a way of kind of a skin in the game, so to speak. And that element of how you connect that to the table, at least the way that I think of it in my own head. One, we're invited to that table, right? Come and sit, you're here. Regardless of how you got here, or why you're here, or how you're feeling, or what your state is, this table is the same for all. And you've heard me talk about that with the words of institution, how Paul institutes those words very intentionally to be inclusive to everyone. But you also have a stake in that. You have to get here. You have to sit down. You have to be willing to look your neighbor in the eye. And then you have to be willing to get up from that table and go out into the world to take the gifts that we receive here and share them with the world. That's the reciprocal nature and the reconciling nature of the table, is that it doesn't come to you. We come to it, right? Jesus comes to us, but we come to the table. And there's some element of that, something reciprocal there. There's an agency to that, which I think is important. And so my hope is that as we get a chance to look at this from a world communion standpoint, so now it's not just thinking about how we collect ourselves here locally, but how we are collected globally. And then to have someone who can represent some little sliver of another part of the world. To be able to think about that from a more literally global perspective is pretty fascinating and amazing and humbling. Because if we were traveling to Malawi and to Reverend Humphrey's church, he would be, they might be celebrating communion with us, and many elements of that I'm sure are similar, but there are pieces of that are unique, and so I look forward to hearing what that would look like if we were there. Because some parts of it would seem very regular to us, and then other parts we might have to learn or relearn or imagine anew, and that's fascinating. And that's, I think, the beauty of what I think this day can mean, and why I think it's a great start to this season of identity, that I'm kind of trying to coin that phrase, because it reminds us who we are. And I think given the season that we're in, at least the American season that we're in, an election coming up and that kind of thing, to have kind of a step back moment, we can start to look at ourselves with a little bit broader of a view. If you're like me, you read articles and you see things on TV or on the internet. You read things and, you're kind of deciphering the world. In an election year, we tend to focus, rightfully so, on what's right in front of us. But to start to think about life, or be reminded that life is bigger than, what happens in this sea to shining sea, I think is a good thing. So I'm looking forward to that. So that's kind of where we're at this week. There's going to be a lot to do and a lot to see and a lot to remember, and a lot of things to look forward to. So thank you ahead of time for joining us. Thank you ahead of time for welcoming our guest. Please attend those different events if you can. I hope that you get a chance to kind of dive into this passage again, and just thank you for attending to all of that. So in the meantime, I appreciate you joining me for this first look, and I'll see you next time for it. So until then, take care.